Welcome, welcome, welcome. You know what it is. This is N-urch,
Indeed.
not church. And
Welcome.
we got a special guest today. A familiar face you've been seeing, and hopefully he will be a regular face on the Ichabod channel. But we'll talk about that in a second. Welcome, everybody. Come on in.
Brady, we're gonna grab a couple comments from exit strategy. Are there? Yeah, there should be several. Maybe we can grab one or two.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Come on into the
Be
chat.
interesting to see what happens here in Romans 4. It's relatively short, at least if we compare it to the first 3 chapters, right?
Yeah. I was thinking this would probably be a shorter day today. And I was almost thinking like, man, maybe we might want to go forward into chapter 5, but Al would Al would excoriate us if we went into chapter 5 without him. So we'll make the most of chapter 4.
Yeah. Well, we want quality over quantity, and this might be, there's a dense amount of dense arguments being made in chapter 4. Yeah. So we have, when I say dense, I mean it in the pejorative sense. So we have a dense amount. it's pretty compact, but there are a lot of dense arguments being made here,
Yeah.
So it should be fun.
Yeah, we can take our time walking through it and helping people see the BS, to see the con. I'm just going to Facebook real quick to share this out.
Yeah, oftentimes the con, I was thinking about this when I was watching, because I aggregate American evangelical Soundbites for our exit strategy. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about how often it is that they lubricate the nonsense with the theatrics, the bells and whistles. And man, I've been out of the faith for, I don't know, over a decade now, but sheesh, the production value has definitely gone up over the past 5 to 10 years. You have all kinds of backdrops with LED screens and then the music. And some of the bands are, it's tantamount to watching the Tonight Show or something, in terms of the band just being on point and stuff. And I think about how those are distractions. Like they help the message, but they also distract you from the bad arguments and stuff that are being made. And one of the only fortunate things about getting the Bible as a text is you can't really attach the bells and whistles to the text. So if you take your time and just read through it, it just shows itself to be what it is.
Yeah. So without the smoke and mirrors, you got the magic show without the things that make the magic seem magical.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess
okay, Chris.
I was gonna say, I guess the other element of magic that's still there, I guess we'll use in place of it, is that whole thing of univocality, which if you're gonna read, especially like Romans, and even just this chapter makes sense of it, you're really gonna need it, because like you're saying, in terms of dense argumentation, it shows up here, just within the chapter, but also tying it to the rest of Romans. If you don't have that, it will show itself for being what it is.
Yeah. And it's great you say that, because I was about to argue with Jay Witt a little bit there, because I know for me, when I was a believer, I didn't need the bells and whistles, because I thought there was, I'm going to use a word that I would have never used as a believer, but I thought there was magic going on in the text. I thought, who needs, okay, yeah, great if the band is my flavor, great if the speaker is good, but there was enough going on in the text because, Chris, of that univocality, this sense of a divine being is speaking to me through this text. And it was my privilege and my task to figure out how it all fit together and how this mystery could be unworked and why that contradiction is not really a contradiction. And so even without the bells and whistles, I was sort of still blown away until it fell apart for me.
It's all,
Yep.
I got it. Go ahead, Chris.
I was gonna say, I was just curious for you guys. Do you guys still get kind of warm, fuzzy sometimes as you read through the text? Because like Brady was saying, as coming back and reading this because I hadn't read it in a while. I was like, oh man, I still have that feeling like I was mistaken that for being, I guess, the spirit or something who's gonna like tie this grand narrative together.
You're giving them
And I
too much,
realized,
Chris. You're giving them too much. The believers are like, oh, that's the power of God.
I know I figured they would. Well, again, I still have it, but I'm not a believer. It's not supposed to work that way, I thought. But it's just like, well, that's just conditioning. You know, you come to a building and you make a big event about this book. And if you do that when someone's young, you do it enough, it doesn't really leave.
I feel the same way when I'm watching, movies that I watched as a child. I'm like, yo, I remember that scene. I remember feeling that way. I remember. And then other times it's like, wait, I thought this had more power. You know what I mean? Sometimes you watch something you watched 20 years ago and it's like, wait, why did I like this so much?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not just the Bible that happens with.
It makes me, I know you said you didn't need the garnish and the bells and whistles, but I thought immediately of an illustration. Any person who watches old films prior to the advent of basically ubiquitous CGI in movies can recall the kinds of measures they had to use to make the scenes believable. I think if I were to hot link back to a previous episode, which is the mental health episode from last Saturday, I think it was during that Albert he basically took on a Gene Wilder like character. In that movie, there's a fizzy lifting drink scene, and they're being held up by strings as they float, levitate, and they employed the usage of bubbles in that scene to obscure the strings that were holding Charlie and his grandfather up. And I think of some of the garnish and the bells and whistles in Christianity, like the bubbles or the kinds of things, the smoke. Like if you put smoke in a room, it obscures things just enough where you can't see the mechanisms, the stuff that's going on. And basically, hopefully today, what we're going to do is we're going to clear the room of the smoke. We're going to clear the room of the bubbles. We're going to let you see the strings, literally, the strings holding together Paul's arguments. Come on here. I need my organ.
That's a great analogy. That's a great analogy because I have people on my Facebook page right now trying to say, what are you talking about? This week on Facebook, those who've seen my posts, I compared, these viral memes that are going around now where people like close your eyes 70% and tilt your head and squint that other eye and look at this image and you'll get a surprise. And it's supposed to be, Jesus in a mountain or in the bodies of these people or whatever. And I said, it's funny because all these squint your eyes and turn your head and you'll see Jesus. That's sort of what you have to do to get Jesus in the Old Testament. The way the New Testament authors write the New Testament, it's like if you squint your eye and turn your head and lean backwards and look at this verse in the Old Testament, that's Jesus. And we're going to do that today with Romans. We're going to show you how, wait, you got Jesus and the good news, the gospel out of this passage. That's a lot of what we're going to be doing today. So yeah, good stuff.
That's really good. Yeah. Basically, if we give you this putty and give you the wheel, we give you the clay and the wheel, you can fashion any kind of figure you need out of the Old Testament, basically.
Yeah. I got a few quotes from from Exit Strategy. As we were finishing up with Peter N's book, we didn't finish the book, but we're done with it. We're not going to go back into it anymore. We heard your prayers and supplications have been made it have arisen as a sweet aroma to us, and we are no longer going to be going through Peter N's book. But one commenter said, this is at Ace Mac 41721, says, okay, I think I finally understand Peter N's purpose. It's impossible and painful to go around and have to be right about everything. it relieves the pressure to just say, I don't know. But you should still cling to it and be happy you don't have to be right about it. So that's basically a summarizing of what Peter Enns is doing in the book, The Sin of Certainty, trying to get Christians to be okay with not being able to be certain about what you believe. Any others that stand out to you? I'm looking through some more in here.
I was just relying on you to find them, pick them.
All good.
Let me,
No,
you can
I
pick
got 'em.
out maybe another one or two.
Kathy said, please, no more ends. Smiley face. Okay, we got you. I'm trying to find ones that I responded to. I typically go and I try to like, okay, here goes one. This is from Carl U, 8553. Says, appreciate your work. I recently saw Aaron, that's the TikToker who called God a homicidal maniac, the Christian TikToker. He says, I recently saw this guy. He joined the team at the Bible for Normal People, which is Pete Enns and Jared Bias podcast. So me and Jay Witt have been wondering, is that apologist, that guy on TikTok, would he fit in with Peter Enns? And we were trying to go back and forth about, yeah. And this person says, no, he's actually joining their podcast. So Pete Enns, who wants you to be okay with not being certain with what you believe, is now being joined by this Christian apologist who called the God of the Bible a homicidal maniac, if you take him for what the Bible says about him. So that just goes to show you where Christianity is trending if you want to stick with it. So there you have it.
Yeah, I don't know why. Oh, go ahead, Jay. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I just don't know why that guy just doesn't give it up. if that is, if you think that is what belief of the Bible entails, that what you think it teaches, I don't understand retaining the title Christian or something like Christian adjacent, but then being like, well, obviously I just don't believe that, and then I insert what I want. Well, okay. Well, you just have, I guess, your own religion unto yourself. What you don't have is Christianity or any other religion.
Yeah. Great point.
Yeah, well, I mean, it basically turns Christianity into, essentially, if you use Christianity the way Aaron is commending it to us, it will be ever evolving, and it's basically just Lego blocks. Like I think I said that in our like you can take them and make whatever you want to make out of it. If you want to make an airplane, go ahead.
Yeah.
If you want to make a skyscraper.
That's why we got into that little back and forth on Tuesday, Jay, because even as you're saying it now, I'm saying, oh, that is mysticism. But then when you fall back on the pillars of the Christian faith, the resurrection and the incarnation, then it's not mysticism. So I'm like, which is it? Is it this thing you can make whatever you want out of, or is it the definite thing that the text says it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think for him, it's probably the latter.
Well, yeah, I think it definitely is something you can make anything you want out of in his mind, because if you ever try to pin him down on the resurrection, I'm nearly certain Enns is going to say, look, man, this is what I say today, but you might hear a different answer from me tomorrow. Like, I really believe that's his
you're
take.
not wrong.
And if that's,
you're not wrong. Somebody asked him one time back and about a couple of years ago, somebody asked him, if you could say what you just said about the Christian faith, I forgot what he said, but it was something very nebulous. Somebody asked him, not why are you still a Christian, but why are you still an evangelical? And his response was basically what you just said. He says, I don't know, maybe this is where I need to be for now, but maybe tomorrow I'll be somewhere else.
Yeah. So yeah, it's essentially, I don't know. Someone might argue that that's pretty innocuous if you have a religion that's like that and you've taken the more harmful things out.
Yeah.
Someone may argue that's harmless. But I wonder, that's a whole that would take us in a whole different direction. I guess at some point we got to get to Romans 4.
Yeah. All right. So just needs a little bit of house cleaning here. Some of you are used to our Sunday morning podcast. Is typically me, Jay Witt, and Albert Kim. Albert Kim is doing well. There's no issues or anything like that. He just had a family event. He says, I'm going to be extremely tired from this family event the day before. So he said, yo, I may not make it Sunday. And we say, hey, rather than go back, trying to put pressure on you to get back to be here Sunday, do your family thing, enjoy that. And I'm always jumping at a chance to bring other cats on to the podcast. And so I was none too shy about hitting up Christmas Prime, my man Chris, and say, hey, would you come back on to join us on a Sunday morning? So y'all welcome Chris to the pod. And in the comments, if you will, encourage him, like I asked you before, encourage him to join the fight more full time, to start a YouTube channel. Or whoa.
I don't have applause, but I have a couple gunshots.
Hey, there's too much going on in the world right now to just hit us with these random gunshots. Don't do that. Everybody, you're safe, you're fine. Then again, depending on where you
are. Even worse, I guess, in some ways. The flex bomb,
we just had an eclipse. We just had an earthquake. Now you gonna hit us with the bombs? Come on, man.
See, I live near Richmond, so I was like, oh man, I guess it's just another day in this city.
Did you guys see?
I gotta give you applause.
Was that North Carolina or somewhere where these kids they were having this block party and it turned into a mass shooting at this block party the other day, just yesterday?
Yeah,
craziness. Yeah. Crazy. So
they also
I feel like
just,
what you say, Chris?
They just intercepted.
I was gonna say, I don't know that I may have heard about it. It's just unfortunate. Like I work in an emergency department, so I may have heard it, but I also feel like I've heard that story just recently somewhere else.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, they recently intercepted a guy who was planning I think it was 2 school shootings too.
Cool.
I just read that in the news. I think it was this morning. It was like, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, thankfully they intercepted it.
Yeah. Sorry to frighten you all with the gunshots. Yeah. Sorry for that. Trigger warning. We got sound effects in the show.
Trigger warning. No pun intended.
No pun intended. All right. So we do N-urch every other Sunday. 2 Sundays ago, we were looking at Romans chapter 3, and Paul is building a case to be able to put Jews and Gentiles in the same boat. And we have been comparing Paul to a snake oil salesman. Those guys who, back in the olden days, before there was a medical board to certify who's a real doctor, you could just have people come in town with, hey, I got the cure for what ails you. And the cure for what ails you is a way to not have to be specific about what your real issue is. If I really had a cure for your real issue, I'd really have to say, this is what you're suffering from. But if I just say I got the cure for what ails you, you'll come out the house, back pain, neck pain, arthritis. You'll come out the house for whatever, because I haven't specified what the problem is. Well, Paul comes in town and he tries to invent a big enough problem so that everyone has to come to his carriage, his horse and carriage, and
his apothecary.
Yeah, what he's selling out the back of the horse and carriage here. And what does he do? He tries to sell everyone on, we're all lawbreakers. We're all people who are guilty of breaking God's law. The Gentiles, you broke God's law because it was written on your heart. The Jew, you broke God's law because it was written on stone. And you can go back and check out chapter 2, episode 2, where we talked about those arguments, in episode 3 of N-urch, where we talked about his arguments in chapter 3, where he says, all have fallen short, the Jew and the Gentile, so that no one's going to be justified by works of the law. So then how are you going to be justified? Well, you're going to be justified by faith. And in chapter 4, he's going to show why this should not be so shocking. Paul's going to show why this is nothing new. God's always been in the business of justifying by faith. How? Go back to the patriarch, Abraham. So we're going to talk about that. And And like Jay said, we're going to show you the strings behind this magic act, and hopefully you'll see what's going on here. Any other thoughts before we dive in terms of having read the chapter, getting ready to dive back in? Chris, I know you said it's been a while since you had read it and you looked at it and you got some of those fuzzies from before.
Yeah.
Any
Well,
other
I mean,
thoughts?
a thought I came away with now wondering was like, man,
Mm,
this whole idea of like law and works.
mm,
I kind of wonder if or faith and works. This idea of not having works but having faith, but then faith ends up being buttressed by works. So isn't it really just works? Doesn't it just deflate to works?
mm,
Um, so sometimes I think as I'm reading this, it makes me think that maybe faith just acts as a kind of a Trojan horse
mm,
to works again.
mm.
Mm,
Wow.
mm. Yeah.
We could pause right there. Jay, what thoughts?
No, I mean, it really, I
Mm,
was thinking something along those same lines. Those, he really, I mean, there's something to be said for creating a reasonably complex argument around a thing, even if it's totally false.
yeah.
Because once you get a person thinking about it enough,
Mm,
they're like, is it, it's not a straightforward sham, something that's easily just dismantled.
yeah.
He's making you have to walk through these corridors. And he's like, oh, look at this over here. And then you look at this. And if you take that and that, and like we said before with the salesman analogy, before he doesn't allow you to stop and look at any one of the things he's referring to, particularly passages. Like in chapter 4, he takes you to look at Abram, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
Abraham as he refers to him. And then he runs you to the Psalms. But you don't park down there long enough to really kind of take in any real context or
Right.
anything. So he's just kind of, you're going through these corridors. You look in this room, open that door. Okay, check that out. This happens here. Okay, now go here. And he opens another door, and he's linking the two. But if you actually look at them in their context,
Mm,
they don't equal the same thing.
yeah.
But he's
Exactly.
not. There's just being a fast talker. I mean, this is the language we speak of con men, and like we say, oh,
Mm,
he's a fast talker.
mm,
This really what's going on here. It's just in written form. Now, if we slow it down, you would think exegesis. How you have these expository preachers who go verse by verse. You would think that itself might reveal the sham. Just being able to slow the pace up. Only they slow it down only to buttress the bad arguments with more scriptures. So they just pile on. you know. Anyway,
yeah.
I don't want
Yeah.
to go on
No,
and on.
that's great. I love both of those. Chris, that comment about faith being a Trojan horse to sneak in more works. I love that. That's going to come back up. And your point, Jay Witt, you made me think about the constellation. If somebody's saying, hey, look at this point here, look at that point here, look at that point there, look at that point there. And if you draw
Mhm.
a line between this star, that star, that star, that star, that star, you get a
Yeah.
handle, or you get a ladle, or you get a bear, or you get a. But wait, why
Mm,
did you point to those stars? Couldn't you have pointed from this star to that star over
mm,
there? And wouldn't you've got a different
yeah.
shape if you'd done that?
Mm.
Yeah, but don't do
Sounds
that.
like Bible translation.
Yeah, look at the stars I pointed out to you, not the ones you want to point out. And you could do that with, I mean, as many stars as there are. That's how many verses you have in the Old Testament. So Paul could have gone to a bunch of different passages and drawn a different picture. But because he wanted the picture that he's got us looking at in chapter 4, he's going to point to these passages. And so if you look at this as constellation, you realize you can make whatever image you want by being the one to choose which stars we're going to point at today. And that's what's going on here.
Yeah, he sets a precedent
Mm,
sort of for the way Christians today, because we always are accusing Christians, like, that's far fetched. Why are you drawing that conclusion from this event and that? But like we've said this time and time again, the precedent has been set by the actual authors of the Bible because they're doing it all the time. So they're
wow.
sort of teaching people.
Yeah.
They're teaching people how to engage in eisegesis.
So I was going to save this point for later because we haven't even diven into the text yet, but this is all hopefully what we're doing right now is we're pointing to different constellations so that as we go into the text, people will say, oh, I see how you can get this too. And matter of fact, this makes a little more sense to what Paul is doing. But I was going to say the same point you just made, Jay, but you can see this in the Gospels because when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you don't get this idea of salvation by faith. The idea of believing is nowhere near as strong as it is when you get to John. John is all about believing that I'm the one who was sent. It's all about the kingdom. It's already here. It's in your midst. It's the spiritual thing. Whereas in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's much more like, think about the Great Commission. Go into all the world, baptizing in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and teaching them to observe all that I taught you. Matthew, Mark, and Luke is a much more works idea. The ones who are going to be saved are the ones who do these things. Blessed are these kinds of people. But Paul's justification by faith, which we're going to get into, and John's gospel of the world, so that whoever believes, that's a much later constellation, because Paul's got you looking at different stars now, and he's changing what you're seeing when you look, quote unquote, into the heavens. So just be thinking about that as we dive into this passage. So should we dive in?
Indeed.
Let's do it.
I'm reading from the RSV. If you guys have a different version, that's fine. That'll help illuminate what some of the interpretive choices may have been if you have a different version, but either way, I'm going to be reading from the RSV. Okay. You'll see it pop up in a second. All right. So stop me when you want to stop me. Romans chapter 4, Paul continues. What then shall we say about Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, to the one who works, his wages are not reckoned as a gift, but as his due. And to one who does not work, but trusts him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is reckoned as righteousness. I'm going to just stop right there before we get into the quote from the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that came away when I was reading this is that there's a kind of, it's like, at least how we understand Paul, maybe this is like a theological bias, but we'll make this separation between like faith and works. But what we're really talking about is merit. And I think what's wrong with this passage is it says like, well, where it says, if Abraham was justified by works, then he would have something to brag about, but not before God. But okay, whatever works turns out to be, what he does actually have to brag about is being able to have faith. Is that he has faith, and so it's like if someone wants to say, "Well, wait, but that's not a work," but it is something that is merited
it's
to
meritorious,
him.
Yes.
Yeah, it's meritorious. He had faith, and then God did something by way of response. So whether or not it was a work, whatever that turns out to be, he still did something that was meritorious, and then God responded on his behalf. So it kind of doesn't make sense.
Well, what about the person who will go to the New Testament and say, but even faith is a gift. He gives to each person a measure of faith.
From the Ephesians, that's what the so-called writer of Ephesians, Paul, that is, claims there. But of course, you have to assume that he is the writer. I'm guessing most people assume that, but yeah.
Yeah, Chris.
I'm listening.
Okay, but even then, it doesn't make sense because it's like if someone then gifts you something, in this sense, it's even worse. Like if God is giving a gift of faith and then giving you, accrediting something for you for something that He essentially made you do, like again, in terms of like the merit and I guess Paul is commending faith, like having faith, like you should have it. It was like, well, I just have to wait, I guess, for God to give it to me.
Right.
Yeah.
If it's a gift from God, why are you asking me to do anything?
Right.
He's got to give me that gift.
Right.
Yeah.
But I also can't be blamed if I don't have it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I almost feel like he's been cornered in this way by I think if we zoom out and we see his larger goal being a way to evangelize these Gentiles who were largely uncircumcised, which it seems that that's at the heart of this thing.
Hmm.
He's been cornered by a desire to render circumcision obsolete.
Right.
And so he's made this large argument about the obsolescence of circumcision via Abraham. But then in the process of doing that, he's got this conundrum now because he's making arguments that basically basically end up rendering works of almost any sort to be not of any salvific value.
Hmm.
So how does he turn this thing? Well, then he has to make faith into this thing that's of value, but then he ends up, it's almost like the infinite regress that we run into when we start talking about things that are existent needing a creator, because then it's like, all right, now you have the faith there, but okay, what are you going to do about the faith? Now the faith has become merited. Okay, now I have to give the faith to you as a gift, which kind of, it's like, okay, then if you're just going to give out, basically, if you're just giving out salvation, we don't need any of this scheme.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
if you think about it.
Yeah, yeah.
All right.
That was the thing that kind of occurred to me coming back to it, is that the New Testament in particular has a big problem with in philosophy is called overdetermination.
Hmm.
Like you have you can have an explanation for an event that has a sufficient amount of causes, but then once you start to add in like that plus one, well then it's like, well, that plus one doesn't need to be there, so I call it a plus one. And the Bible is
Mm,
full of them. It's like, you have something that's sufficient to explain an event. And a lot of times it's God is the plus one in the scenario. It's like, well, why is this here? So like with what Jay is highlighting, and especially when it comes to merit, it's like, well, if you're giving me the gift, the basically what it entails when it all boils down is that we just have to be passive agents.
Hmm.
God gives the
mm.
gifts of faith. He's doing everything. I guess like the Calvinists would be like, yay. But but they're just shells kind of for God's, I guess, the theological play.
Yeah. We're gonna have to have you back on when we get to chapter 9, I think, Chris, because the question of, well, then why does God find fault does come up from Paul's own lips. But before we get that far, I've talked about this on our podcast before, but now I finally get to talk about it in context, because everything that you all just said are great questions to ask if you take Paul at face value, that this is what God is doing, that God is now, he's giving faith and he's counting faith as righteousness and all this. But I titled this episode Paul the Lying Apostle for a reason. Because Paul says something that's not true here. And you really got to slow down. Like I said, why are you looking at that star and connecting to that star? Couldn't we connect it to a different star? And are you seeing that right? What we're going to do is go back and look at what happens in the Old Testament and see, is Paul telling the truth about what he says happens? Verse 3.
Mm.
For what does scripture say? So he's banking his argument on what he believes you can find in the Old Testament. What does scripture say? Verse 3. Abraham believed God, and what's it? It is Abraham believing God. That's the it. That's the work or the gift, whatever we want to say there. That's the conversation we just had. Is it a work or a gift? I don't know. But Abraham believing God, that thing, his belief, was reckoned or counted to him as righteousness. The question that I never asked was, is that what the Old Testament actually says? And I'll never forget what made me ask this question was, I was in seminary, and I was in a Hebrew 3 or Hebrew 2, one of my Hebrew language classes. And the professor began to talk about how when you see certain constructions in the Hebrew, they don't have a word for he. And so the only way you know that it's saying he did such and such is because the verb will be tensed and gendered a certain way. And if it's the second person masculine, then you translate that verb as he did such and such. And then I got to thinking, well, wait, if that's the case, you don't really know who the he is. You have to find out who the he is in that passage. And the professor said, yeah, sometimes it's not clear who the he is, who the person is, especially if you have two people being talked about in the same sentence. So I'm going to go back to the Genesis passage and show you why this is not confusing, but why it's not the thing that Paul is saying it is. All right. So if that's confusing, just bear with me for a second. I'll read it in the passage and then we'll see. Should have had this pulled up, but you could turn if you want back to Genesis 15. And forgive me if my computer starts going slow because I got a bunch of screens open right now. And remember what Romans said, right? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. It was counted to him as righteousness. Now, Genesis 15:6, this is the verse that he's quoting. And he believed the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. So it's a little different, the construction here. It's not it was counted to him as righteousness. It's he counted it to him as righteousness. Now, the question that you have to ask yourself is, who is he? Who is the he in this passage? I think it's pretty clear that the first he, well, I'll just ask you guys, who would you say the first he is in this passage?
In verse
In
6,
6, yes.
God.
Well, read it slowly.
All right.
I'm
First
stepping out
he.
for a moment. I have to get
Got you.
something here, but I'll be right back.
Yep.
So I'll just read it out loud. It says,
Yeah. Okay.
Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness.
Okay. So what version are you reading? I'm sorry.
Holman Christian Standard.
Okay. Got you. Got you. All right.
I
So
can look on your screen. It just might look
yeah.
awkward. That
All good.
and he believed the Lord, and he
All right. So hold on.
reckoned.
Let's just deal with that. The difference between your translation and mine. You said you're reading the what translation?
Holman Christian Standard.
Okay. So what they're doing, because they name the first person, they don't say he, they name Abraham as the actor. And they do that to help people understand what's going on in the text. But in the Hebrew, this verse right here, Abraham is not named because they've been talking about Abraham. They've been talking about Abraham and the Lord. And so the Hebrew is just, it's the word believed, and it's tensed in the second person and masculine. So it's just he believed, not Abraham believed. All right. So the first he is, there's no name. It's anarthrous, as we say. No name on that one. But he believed the Lord. Okay. What's the rest of your passage say in verse 6?
And he credited it to him as righteousness.
So in my verse, that's a second he. In your verse, it's the first he. But who would you say that he is?
The second one, right?
The second one, yes.
God.
Okay. That's what Paul wants you to think. Paul wants you to think that the second he there is God. But what I'm going to argue is that that second he is the same he as the first he. All right.
Okay.
So the first he is Abraham, and your translation helps us see that it should be Abraham, right? For those who are, I hope I'm not confusing anybody. What I'm reading here, the RSV, has he twice. He believed the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. Chris's version doesn't have two he's. It translates the first he as Abraham to help us understand the relationship between these people here. But then it's got he in the second. And what I'm arguing is both of these he's refer to Abraham. He believed the Lord, and he, Abraham, counted it to him as righteousness. If this is the case, then what Paul does in Romans 4 is invalid, because the Lord is not the one counting anything to Abraham. It's Abraham counting righteousness to the Lord. Now, why do I say that? All right. I wish Jay Witt had to go handle something. I wanted to throw something up on the screen. I'll do this. I'm going to share something else real quick. And in the chat, I want you guys to rock with us in the chat and see if you can put this together here. Let's say I showed you this.
I'm back.
Okay. Okay. Jay, what version are you reading?
The RSV.
Okay. So we
You
just
want me
went
to
through.
read another version?
No, that's fine. That's fine. We just went through real quick to try to figure out who are the he's, who's the first he, and who's the second he. I'm going to put
Okay,
something
let's
up on the
see.
screen. Let's just say I showed you this. This is not from Genesis 15:6. This is from Ichabod 15:6, right? Let's just say
You're
I
gonna have to
showed you.
continue this book, by the way.
Say
You're
again.
gonna have to continue this. Yeah, I said you're gonna have to make this a running series. So
Okay,
just
cool.
kind of write your own book.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's say I showed you this passage, right? And the passage says, he asked Chris to join him on the podcast, and he was glad he did. Let's just say the first he is Jay Witt. The first he is Jay Witt. You know this right now. Jay Witt asked Chris to join him on the podcast. So in the version that Chris read, it would have named Jay Witt as the first he to just help you understand who the two people are. But let's say you read this. He asked Chris to join him on the podcast. He is Jay Witt. And he was glad he did. Who is the second he? Who is the third he referring to?
Yeah.
Is it clear?
It's not clear. No.
Who
You have to
could it
make
be?
a interpretive. Yes.
Yeah. How could you interpret this? Who could
You're
the
saying the third he.
the second
right?
and the third he. They could all be somebody different. They
Well,
could all be a different person.
Well, not the second
I
one.
think
They both
go ahead.
could.
What did you say, Chris?
Well, it can't be the second because that would entail that Jay Witt asked Chris to join Jay Witt on the. Oh, I guess yeah.
No.
Yeah.
It depends on the context. It depends on the context because if something was said prior to that to imply that the person you're asking might be happy, then that second one could be the person.
Right. So take out all the he's and replace them with names and see how many ways you can interpret this.
Yeah, I think the second him has to be Jay Witt, but for sure for the.
It doesn't have to be.
So it'd be Jay Witt asked Chris to join Chris on the podcast?
No. Oh, not him. Don't change the him, only the he.
You're talking about the he's, right? Okay. Yeah, you know.
Sorry, that was confusing. Don't mess with the him, only the he's. Okay. Because in the passage, the him is okay. The him is fine. We know who the him is. It's the he that's the problem.
Right. No, I agree with you.
I mean, it's all contextual. Like
right. So read it the different ways it can be read.
What's coming before and what's happening now.
I'm
depending on what happens before.
Read it either way that it can be read. Just replace the he's with names.
Okay. All right. Let's see it. All right. Brady asked.
Well, no.
Keep
it Jay Witt. Keep it Jay Witt.
All right. Jay Witt asked Chris to join him on the podcast, and Jay Witt was glad he did.
Replace all the he's with names.
Or we can say Jay Witt asked Chris to join him on the podcast, and Chris was glad he did, or was glad Jay Witt did. I mean, you can read this probably 4 different ways.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to get you to understand.
4, maybe 5.
That's what I'm trying to get you to see.
Go ahead. So,
I can see where you're going. I do wonder if you're going to run into a problem with just verse 7. I think verse 7 has to be Yahweh.
Right. I think verse 7 is plain. It has to be Yahweh. But we're sticking to verse 6. Verse 6. Jay Witt asked Chris to join him on the podcast. You could say, and Chris was glad Jay Witt did. Or Jay Witt asked Chris to join him on the podcast, and Jay Witt was glad that Chris did. That Chris did join him on the podcast. It could be going that way. There's many different ways you could read this. As long as it's he, it's not clear. My point is simply you need context to tell you who the he's are. Now, you went after it to verse 7 to figure out who might the he be. But before we go to verse 7, I think we need to go back to the passages before. All right? I'm going to take this off the screen and go back to the text. Give me 1 second.
I like how you had as a backdrop, you had the Shekinah.
I was
You had
trying
the
to get something that
cloud.
would help give it a more grand sense of what was going on there.
Perhaps that's the cloud that's obscuring the meaning. perhaps that's the whole purpose of the Shekinah, is to obscure meaning.
Yeah. Yeah. So verse 7, the he is clear because he says something, and what he says is, I am the Lord. So that tells you who the he is in verse 7. But
do you
before
have
we get,
also in your translation?
say again,
Do you have also in your translation?
in what verse?
And 7.
No.
Because it's like okay, say I have an also, so it
Right.
makes me think this is a continued thought.
Exactly.
Like,
So you have translators there adding things into the text to point you to certain constellation. I want you
gosh.
to see that this is Yahweh doing the counting here. So I'm going to put a also in the text.
Oh wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. The translators
Interesting.
have ways to get you to get what they want in the text. And if they're buying Paul's argument, then they're going to say, oh, this has to be God doing the counting here.
Huh. No,
So,
that's very
yeah,
interesting.
yeah,
Because I mean, I was seeing kind of where your argument was going, but I was like, well, the also
right.
kind of so grammatically. So, but now that I'm seeing that this is apparently a translational invention, now I'm like, wow, okay, this is
Yeah.
not as I thought.
And
Yeah.
it's not that they're pulling the also out of thin air. What they're getting is they're probably using the vav there. The vav is and, or, so, also, but. Vav can be translated a bunch of different ways. But in Hebrew narrative, vav is typically going to be and to just continue a narrative. That's what's going on there.
Hmm.
So
So
they
they
can
say go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I don't want to interrupt. Yeah,
No,
go
no, go
ahead.
ahead.
No, continue. No, please
I was going
finish.
to go back to the beginning of verse 15 to kind of give us a context of who the he could be there in verse 6.
Okay. Yeah.
Sure?
So the I was only going to say that the only part, obviously, any analogy breaks down at some point. The
Mm.
only difference in the analogy of constellations is that usually they involve straight lines. So that the shortest distance between 2 points is straight lines. But
Right.
here, the translators might be using, I don't know, thunderbolts and all kinds of other, curvilinear lines, to get them to the next
Yeah,
point.
you
You
got
see
to
what I mean?
zigzag around these stars here to get to this point here
Yeah,
to make the image I want you to
yeah,
get. But let's just go back to
yeah. This is
context.
not. Mhm.
What's happening in chapter 15 of Genesis is Abraham is bringing charges against Yahweh. Abraham is bringing charges against, or maybe not even Yahweh at this point. Maybe this is just El at this point. We got to figure out what's going on here in these texts. But Abraham is bringing charges against the Lord because Abraham says, look at verse 2. We'll start at verse 1. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. So God's been promising Abraham, I'm going to bless you and I'm going to give you what you need. I'm going to give you a descendant. I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to make you a people. I got you. But Abram says, O Lord God, what will you give me? Let me read it in the language that's here in RSV. What wilt thou give me? For I continue childless. So he's complaining to God here. You said you were going to give me children. You said you were going to give me land. Now here you are coming to me in a vision, but I still ain't got no son. Oh Lord, what wilt thou give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. And Abraham said, behold, thou hast given me no offspring, and a slave born in my house will be my heir. He's bringing God up on charges for being unfaithful. You said you would give me X and Y. I ain't got none of that. A slave in my house is going to be my heir because I got no son. You're not righteous, God. You're not fair. You're not faithful. Verse 4, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir. Your own son will be your heir. Now, he brought him outside. We could do the same thing there about who's the he, but I think it's safe to assume it's the Lord bringing Abram outside, right? Because the Lord has to justify himself to Abram, saying, I'm not going to leave you without a child. He brought him outside. It's funny, we were talking about constellations and stars, because look here. He brought him outside and said, look toward the heaven and number the stars. If you're able to number them, and number the stars, if you're able to number them. He said to him, so shall your descendants be. Now, you could ask the question I asked before, when he says in verse 6, and he believed the Lord. He there is clearly Abram, because the other person is the Lord. Now, what sense does it make? Forget Paul for a second. If you had no Pauline theology to have to reconcile, if you just read verses 1 through 5, and then you got to verse 6, and all you saw was, and he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. What would make you think that it was God counting Abraham as righteous if you had no Pauline instruction to point you that way, and not Abram counting it to the Lord as righteousness, because now he believes God's going to keep his promise and be faithful?
I don't know. It's pretty, I mean, no, you make a very good argument. And I wonder, basically you kind of have to try to like carry the theme throughout to see if it remains a constant.
Mm-hmm.
But this is, I mean, I guess my insight here is kind of make it probably a different than you are. Is just I don't think believers really understand how much heavy lifting translators do.
Yes.
Because even you and pointing out the also, that changes everything. If
Yes.
you don't bring that to this and you take that out, kind of following your train of thought, it's a plausible interpretation.
Yeah.
That's a completely different. It's a completely different tone on the story.
Yes. We are dependent on these translators to point us in certain directions, because if not, it's just us there in the text with all these, and he did such and such, and he did, and we got to figure out, well, who is the he here? And like I said, I remember sitting in class and thinking, well, damn, how are we so sure that it's God counting righteousness to Abraham and not Abraham counting God as righteous? And then I went back and looked at the context and said, it makes complete sense that it's Abraham now telling God, okay, I believe you now. I'm not going to count you as unfaithful or unright. I'm going to count you as righteous as you're going to keep your promise. I don't know how in the world I had never seen that until then. And then it was funny because I was sharing this on Facebook, and then somebody pointed me to Myth Vision podcast. My friend Derek had on Dr. James Tabor, and James Tabor actually makes the same point. So I'm going to play James real quick, and then we can talk about it, and then go back into the rest of what Paul is doing here. Any thoughts, Jay, before I play James Tabor?
I would say that no, I think we've talked about this previously, and as I was looking into it, I thought, whether or not, I think you make a very convincing argument, but one has to consider amid all of this talk that whether or not you're correct or the translators are correct, a lot has to be said for the fact that the salvation of the only souls that will be saved on earth is tucked into, if this is a pita pocket, the salvation's in there, but the pita pocket that it's tucked into is essentially a thing that is up for this kind of interpretive work, which could lead you into wildly different conclusions. So at best, what you have is a God that's seeking to save people using a method that's almost seemingly meant to obscure the means of salvation from the recipients of such salvation. You see what I'm saying? So, like, there is a way that this could have been said, even in the Hebrew, I'm imagining, where it would have been clearer,
Yeah.
But to make it in a passage and where you have to do this kind of work to get down to the meaning of what's being said. I mean,
well, no, I don't think that's
for instance,
necessarily the case. Let me just say this, and then you can go to your for instance if it still holds. I don't think it was that unclear, because you have to ask yourself, why is it that you don't hear this kind of talk about faith being the road to justification until Paul? Like, why is no other Jewish scholar, rabbi saying what Paul is saying until Paul says it. It was clear to them. It's Paul who's making it unclear.
Well, that I think it buttresses my point is that some guy who's savvy enough to try to work his theology into the text, like Paul, that's who I'm talking about, was able to come along and use language that wasn't, he found a loophole. It's almost like a tax loophole that he found in the Old Testament. Being a scholar of the Old Testament, he was like, all right, if I'm going to squeeze my scheme of salvation into, where can I find a place that I could squeeze in? And just think about it. He has certain criteria in mind. He's like, all right, it needs to involve, oh, what better than the patriarch of the Jewish religion? So, okay, let me see if I can find a passage dealing with the patriarch that's universally respected in the Jew, and of course the Gentiles, we don't have to worry about them because they haven't embraced the Jewish text the way the Jews have. So I have to find a passage where some reference to either salvation or righteousness is made, but it has to be elastic enough to allow for my interpretation.
Yeah.
And if you think of it that way, yes, he's found a passage where, maybe everybody else is scratching their like, you're really dragging this, you're stretching it. But he's like, hey, he's throwing his hands up, giving the Kanye shrug. He's like, it could be there, right? It could be there because of the way, look, is the he here? Is that the he, or is this the he? Is that, Like if he throws up enough, it's like reasonable. It's the OJ trial, since that's in the media right now. It might be apparently the guilty party might be at hand, but if I can throw up enough reasonable doubt, like if the glove don't fit, you must acquit. So he's like, if I could just kind of
even
make
if he's
people
wrangling
be
his
like,
hand through the glove to make it not fit, even if he's doing all kinds of, it didn't fit. So it
didn't fit. So it's like, if I leave you scratching your head at the end of this, where he does make a good point. Who's the he here? Who's the he?
Yeah.
I just think this is interesting because it seems like that definitely, this is a guy who poured over the text and who had criteria in mind. He's like, I need to attach this to the Father, as he refers to him later, the Father of the faith. Like I have to find a passage where there is enough of a tax loophole or is elastic enough for me to get everything I got to get in there. I'm sorry if that was long-winded.
No, that's fine. But here's what's interesting about this is, you got to ask yourself, to the person that thinks, oh, God just held this back from them and then finally revealed it to Paul in the fullness of time. Isn't it interesting that no other Hebrew scholar, there's no sect of Judaism that was talking this justification by faith and going back to Abraham to find it until this passage? You got to think about, why is that this invention comes along here? So let me play Dr. James Tabor getting to the same point. This is a video on Myth Vision's channel where he goes through several of Paul's misuses of the Old Testament. I posted my comment about this on Facebook, and then somebody said, hey, you're not the only one that's saying this, and they tagged this video on Facebook. So here's Dr. James Tabor. Oh, sorry, can you hear it? I didn't share my sound yet, so let me share my sound. All right.
Him. And he's so glad that he found a scripture in Genesis 15, verse 6, that Abraham, before he was circumcised, that's in chapter 17. So I think the day he found this, he was jumping around the room. Wow. So my people aren't circumcised.
That's funny, Jay Wick, because he's saying the exact same thing that you just said. Like, I'm going to go searching through the scriptures to find something. And when he found it, he's probably jumping for joy. And he's saying the exact same thing you just said.
That he found a scripture in Genesis 15, verse 6, that Abraham, before he was circumcised, that's in chapter 17. So I think the day he found this, he was jumping around the room. Wow. So my people aren't circumcised, but if they believe God, they can be justified by faith. Because it says here, if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about. Well, of course he wasn't justified by works. No human being is without sin. That's Hebrew Bible all the way through. For what does Scripture say? Now look at the quote. Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Well, that sounds kind of good. Abraham's a sinner. But in Genesis 15, is Abraham a sinner? What did he believe God? He put his trust in God. God had just told him, you're going to have a son, you see? And that it's not going to be Ishmael. This is a son of promise. And he believed God. And
He said Ishmael, but it was Eleazar in that text.
I would translate it and understand it, and I'm not, dogmatic on this. Abraham believed God and counted him as righteous. God. Not Abraham became righteous by believing, but God said, I'm going to give you a son. He didn't stagger in unbelief, as Paul says, but he was firm in his trust. So he believed God and reckoned or counted God as righteous, meaning God's going to do what he said. So it's almost the same point as Habakkuk on the end.
So I'll stop it there. But when I saw James say that, I'm like, man, I can't be the only one looking at this text saying there's something else going on here. And it feels almost like blasphemous, to say the Apostle Paul could be wrong. But I don't think it's just that he's wrong. I think he's, like Jaywitt said, he's using motivated reasoning. He's motivated to find what he wants to see in that Old Testament text. Going back to Sharon. Any other thoughts on that before we?
Well, it's funny. It's funny you use that word, like that term, because like I know what it is, but I know people don't, and it's kind of hard to explain it to people in like a short soundbite, but also distinguish it from confirmation bias, which is something people know more about. But it's almost like Paul, and maybe this is just a part of religion. Not maybe, it is. It's almost like the motivated reasoning is contagious because it spreads onto us and how we interpret the rest of the Bible and even Paul. It's like we have this goal in mind. And, if we see things that deviate from it, like we look away from that, we like suppress those things. But we have the goal of reaching, like I said before, in the past episode, the goal of orthodoxy. And what underlies orthodoxy, or part of it, is coherence. Like if you don't have a coherent theory, you can't have orthodoxy. So these things like play together in like the motivated reasoning concoction that gets us the Christianity that we have.
Yeah, good point. Good point. And this is so important because, like you said, this is how we get to the Christianity that we have. If this is undone, this is one of the things that scared me in seminary. This is not something that was like, nobody taught me this in seminary. They were trying to reinforce, like David said about the constellations and about the exegesis being done in the churches. They're slowing it down to firm up something that we probably should not have been thinking in the first place. So they weren't teaching me that Paul was wrong, but they were giving me tools that I was able to say, well, dag, if I use these tools, I can see where this is not where we should have ended up. But because this is where we ended up, now we do have, on top of motivated reasoning, now we do have confirmation bias because I want to keep ending up there. So I'm going to keep interpreting it that way. And so you're kind of caught in this loop of, I've got to keep coming to this same conclusion or I'm not going to be orthodox anymore. Which is a weird way to live your life. Somebody told a story one time about these executives in a boardroom. They were trying to figure out how to make, so you see my water bottle here, how to make these water bottle caps tamper proof. And they were like, man, we've got to get this out to market soon. And they were trying all these different ways to make it tamper proof. And everything they were doing to make it tamper proof was either not cost effective or it was too much work for the consumer to get the thing off. And they were racking their brains and they could not get it to be tamper proof. And then somebody came up with an idea that revolutionized everything. They said, wait, we're killing ourselves trying to make this thing tamper proof. What if instead of making it tamper proof, what if we made it tamper evident? And everyone's eyes got wild. Wait, oh, snap, oh, it's cheap. So we don't have to worry about it being not cost effective. And it's no problem for the customer. Hey, if this top opens without you having to snap something, then you know it's been tampered with. it's tamper evident, not tamper proof. And it created a whole new paradigm for how people thought about how they make these things now. Well, in the same way, what Paul did was I'm trying to come up with something that's going to change it. And he created a new paradigm that shifted everything. But if what I'm saying about this verse, Romans 4, verse 6, if what I'm saying is true, this destroys the paradigm. The whole idea of justification by faith is what the Christian faith that we know of is based on. And if that's based on something that is flawed and untrue, then what does that do to your paradigm? And I remember being in seminary thinking to myself, damn, this doesn't just change everything. This undoes everything. That was one of the many times I thought in seminary, shut up, Brady. Never think that thought again. And I put it away for years because it scared the shit out of me.
You have to consider also, we talked in our last exit strategy about the idea of really questioning things that you want to be true. The fact that you want it to be true should make you more skeptical of a conclusion that leads to the thing that you want to have happen. And here you have him dealing with the issue of Gentiles and a certain kind of synthesis of both Gentile and Jewish faith, right? But also it leads to it exculpates, it frees people from the burden of guilt when they do find themselves wrong in other ways, also outside of circumcision. So you can see how this is a good sell to people, because who can really, I mean, the Old Testament is replete with references to the fact that human beings are basically sinful. What was it, Psalm 51 and so forth. So if you come up with a scheme where you're like, look, you're guilty of breaking some law. I mean, the legal code is expansive. And then you say, okay, I have the solution. This is the good news. The good news is God knows that, and he's made provision for a way to be considered as though you had done all the righteous things without you having. It's like, I'm sold. Because it's scratching an itch you already have. You know that this is a thing. I mean, anybody who looks at the Deuteronomic legal code, it's expansive. Like you look at it, it's like, sheesh. I'm going to break. There's no way. I think you made a reference to if a cop drives behind you long enough, there's going to be some infraction. It basically, if your legal system is elaborate enough, there's no way a person can be flawless in keeping it. And this is something everybody knows. And so it's like, all right, I'm offering you a way out. You don't have to do the legal sacrifices anymore, but you also don't need to get the circumcision. All you have to do is have this no one's really questioning the nature, why faith? What's so valuable about that? At least with the legal code, it's like you can see the inherent value in me not killing my neighbor, right?
Great point. Yeah.
There's an inherent value in me not stealing from somebody, but why is faith so valuable?
Yeah.
It's just an interesting thing,
Oh, that's a great point. Wow.
Right. Especially when, the Bible goes on to make the point. This is the issue of contamination. I'm like, was this James or is this Paul? How do we show that we have faith? Works. Yeah. So again, what is the value of faith if this currency is backed by the thing I thought we were trying to abandon? If you just had faith, no one would know unless you did something, which is I thought.
Exactly.
Exactly. I hope you all are catching what Jay Witt and Chris just said. Those 2 points go together so harmoniously. And we can almost just, and you guys can still stop me wherever you want, but we can almost just read through the rest of this chapter, because everything else he's going to say is based on what he did in verse 3. And so he's going to just try to unpack how Abram, as the father of faith, is the father of both the Jew and Gentile who are going to be justified by faith, just like Abraham was, even though we just saw Abraham wasn't the one who was justified by faith. He justified God by his faith. So it almost undoes everything we're about to read here, but Paul is building such a strong case on it. Now we have to read the rest of his case being built on this faulty foundation. All right. Now to the one who works, his wages are not reckoned as a gift, but as his due. And to the one who does not work, but trusts him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is reckoned as righteousness. So also David pronounces blessing upon the man to whom God reckons righteousness apart from works. Now, David's not even saying all that. So now he's going to put words in David's mouth. Blessed are those whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not reckon his sin. God not reckoning someone's sin is not the same as God counting righteousness to someone. But Paul is recruiting that passage now to make his point. Is this blessing pronounced only upon the circumcised or also upon the uncircumcised? We say that faith was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. No, you say that, Paul. How then was it reckoned to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. This goes to Jay Witt's point. Paul is trying to find a way to get people to be justified outside of the law and outside of circumcision. This is how he's doing it. He received circumcision as a sign or seal of the righteousness which he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So you see, he's harping on this, that Abraham got righteousness by faith. That is not what Genesis says. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised and who thus have righteousness reckoned to them. And likewise, the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but also follow the example of the faith which our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. Verse 13, the promise to Abraham and his descendants that they should inherit the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. If it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression. I'm only pausing in case you guys have any comments that need to be said there. We said so much that applies to all this already, so it may feel like we addressed this, but verse 16. That is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on. Let me just pause for a second. Can you imagine how much of a relief it would have been to those Old Testament saints to hear that the promise depends on faith and not just on obedience to the law? Like, all those people who died in the wilderness, all those people who, were taken into exile, all those people who had faith, at least for a time, but then when God didn't show up, they wilded out because, hey, what are we supposed to do? You're not feeding us. You're not, like, they had faith for a time maybe, but it wasn't long enough. But now Paul saying, oh, no. Here's how we're going to be justified by faith. Like, this is such a relief, like Jay Witt said, that God now.
I could see a mutiny. I could see, remember when they were talking about the forgiving student loans and folks who had paid off of their student loans being like,
exactly.
Yo,
I know where you're going.
They're like, yo, I just paid out $100,000 on student loans and now you just going to forgive these.
Right. All those Old Testament saints who had to obey the law are now looking at the people who are getting this grace and through faith. Like, wait, are you serious? Are you kidding me? This is what you're going to do? Where was that when we were, getting bit by serpents in the wilderness?
Yeah, I mean, I almost wonder if faith solves the problem of, basically, I mean, I guess Paul says this explicitly, but at a certain kind of meta level. Well, people are not going to stop sinning, and no one can fulfill the law. So, like, I guess the way you make rational sense of it is that you add this extra element of faith and that you just believe that God's going to do it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And it's like, like at the end of the year, like how, certain businesses could write off certain losses, like hospitals. They just write them off. But in this religion, we call that faith. That's how you explain people's inability to keep up with the law, even though you actually still expect them to do it.
Wow. And I wonder what this also says about Hebrews, right? The author of Hebrews says that there are certain, think about all the folks who are in what they call the what is it, the Hall of Faith or whatever. All these people who like Abraham believed God, but God didn't give them the promise. He held it till later for us. So he does. The author of Hebrews does make the case that there are all these people in the Old Testament who they please God by faith too, even though all these other people who their works got them, their lack of works got them condemned, but the faith of these other people got them commended. So it's almost like trying to have your cake and eat it too.
I think as a general rule, we can beware of any scheme that has massive implications that has a "for us" clause, like the Hebrew Israelites or any, where it's like you are the. I mean, this is just it's a faction of this larger narcissism that is just intrinsic. I mean, we're inveterate narcissists. So when you have these schemes set up where it's like, you just have to be, it's like, oh yes, that was in play for eons, but it was all so that this could be set up for us. That's typically what the thief thinks about when he goes into a store to grab a bunch of Prada. I mean, you went and bought all of this stuff or whatever, but it's really, I'm the one who needs to be the main beneficiary of whatever your industry was. I mean, it's really the rationale. Like a certain narcissism goes into theft. It goes in, and it also goes into these theological schemes that where you're the primary beneficiary of a soteriology. Like what? Like really? Like you cursed Saul essentially. I'm just to draw a random biblical reference. Saul, was it he incorrectly decided to keep some of the booty from war, some of the gains from war, and sacrificed it supposedly to God, kept it for sacrifice. He's immediately ousted, and he becomes like the enemy of God's chosen one, who becomes David, right? Basically a cursed individual. I mean, let's think of the guy. What's his face? I think it's Uzzah, I think his name is Uzzah, who tries to keep the ark from hitting the ground when it was going to fall off the cattle, and is struck dead immediately. Like, we needn't go further than Genesis 3, right? The first infraction,
right?
It's like it results in the horrid condition, at least according to Paul, all of history, everybody has to die because of a singular infraction, only for God to come along and say, well, we're going to take it light on the law. All right. We're going to give you another scheme. It's like, how are you the founder of both schemes? It just doesn't make sense.
Well,
yeah.
You made me think, Jay Witt. You said there's this inherent narcissism of believing that you're the primary beneficiary of a soteriology. I would add on top of that, there's a narcissism in thinking that you're the primary beneficiary of an eschatology. So you got soteriology and eschatology, these end time ideas that you think all this was set up for you. Like, can you imagine telling the Israelites that no, everything, the 10 commandments and rescuing you from Egypt and the conquest, getting you into all these lands, none of that was for you. I was really just setting it up for a future generation. None of those Israelites would have believed, been excited about thinking that everything that Bible God was doing with them was to benefit some future generation. But then when you get to the New Testament, they would not have thought that they were all being set up for our generation, that God was doing all those things with them. Just he's writing scriptures through us, but he's really writing to people in 2024. Those people thought the end times had come upon them. What did Paul say? Us, upon whom the end of the age has come. They thought they were the primary beneficiaries of soteriology, of eschatology. But now you got people today thinking that they're the primary beneficiaries of soteriology and eschatology. But imagine telling Christians in 2024, no. God's not doing anything for you all. He's just using you all to set something up for a future generation in the year 4025. Wait, none of you are the primary beneficiaries. You're all just a setup for some future generation upon whom these things are going to really matter for.
And consider this: when we, within a single book, think no further than Isaiah or Isaiah or whatever, as some of the Canadians pronounce it, Isaiah. You go there. One of the ways that we can reveal that it has several authors is the discordance, in terms of the writing style or something. So you got to think, if Bible God had this kind of scheme for salvation before, like, in other words, we would never assume, if this were a book or something, that the same author of the one form of salvation was the author of the second. That would actually be a revelation that there were two different authors, essentially, because of just how opposite the thinking is. See, this idea of harmonization or univocality that Chris referred to at the top of the episode, it's really antithetical to our rational capability. You see what I'm saying? Because generally speaking, when we're confronted with that kind of discordance, we say, oh, that's the hand of another author. That's the hand of another, like these things are not harmonious. In fact, they show, there's a certain kind of intentional bad faith that you have to come to the text that forces you into harmonization. Anyway, I could continue. I could keep going on this one thing. I could hammer it for a good half an hour.
We could go to the book of Daniel to see the same thing. There were certain prophecies that had come to pass, but it was clear they had come to pass because the writer was actually writing after those events, but making it look like he was writing before those events. But he was trying to give his generation hope. So he pretended to be prophetic, talking about past things as if they were future things, right? So you give hope to one generation because it looks like, oh, this was prophesied. So maybe the rest of the hope in this book is going to happen for us. Then you write things that are going to happen in the future, and those things don't come to pass. And it's like, okay, well, damn, I guess it's probably for a future generation, because it's not going to happen for us because the prophecy didn't come to fruition. So you're always moving the goalposts. You're always reinterpreting, looking back at the old passages and trying to reinterpret them to give hope for a current generation. And then when it doesn't come to pass for them, you've got to find ways to make it, oh, it wasn't for this generation, it's going to be for a future generation. That's what happens in the text continually. And that's what preterists, are doing today, still trying to find ways to make old prophecies still have current, and if not current, future meaning. And it's embarrassing.
Keeping it relevant.
So, go ahead, Chris.
I'm just curious, do you think that's what's behind Paul's inclusion of Gentiles? Because it's like, as you zoom out, you try to understand, like, okay, well, why is he doing any of this stuff?
Yeah.
Like, because obviously Paul is not inspired by God. God didn't choose him to write this thing. He's introducing foreign concepts onto this older religion. I can understand the issue of faith, because I feel like it does work for you in terms of, like, well, how do we explain this problem of sin that's not going to go away? Are we going to, like, really make sacrifices into perpetuity that still aren't solving the problem? Because we'll sin on the way to making the sacrifice, and then we'll do it right after. Like, this. So we got one-time sacrifice that covers it. We get rid of that problem.
Yeah,
that's, and then faith adds to that. But when it comes to the Gentiles, I'm like, well, how do you explain Paul's desire to include this group? And I'm asking you, is like, do you think that's part of it?
I'm curious to hear if Jaywood has any musings on this. I would think, one, you have this is what leads me to think that Jesus was a real historical person and a failed messianic figure, a failed apocalyptic figure, because it's almost like, there's a meme. I wish I had this meme ready. There's a meme that people are sharing now, where it's got a kid with his head down on a desk, like basically a distraught or disillusioned person, like, oh my gosh. And on one side of him, there's like 100 pictures of lemonade. And on the other side, there's a machine shooting lemons at him, just hitting them with lemons, like those baseball machines that shoot out baseball. It's like it's shooting lemons at him. And the idea of the meme is, it's challenging the concept, if life gives you lemons, make lemonade. Well, he's made a bunch of lemonade, but life just keeps hitting him with lemons. He's just like, oh my God, this won't stop. I say that to say, I think if you're a nation and you're looking for a Messiah, and you've had Messiahs, claimed Messiahs come, and Rome crucifies one, and another one gets taken out by another faction, and all your Messiahs keep dying, and you keep ending up in, first it was Babylon, then it was Persia, then it was Greece, and now it's Rome. Life just keeps throwing us lemons. How do we make lemonade out of these lemons? Well, rather than continuing to look for a Messiah, rather than, as Jay Witt said, continuing to sacrifice, was that you that said this just now, Chris? Sacrifices in perpetuity, rather than do any of that, let's take one of those lemons, one of those failed Messiahs, and turn that lemon into divine lemonade. And so we're going to make this one failed Messiah our once and for all sacrifice. And not only that, but we've got to find a way. We can't beat Rome, and we don't necessarily want to join Rome. But how do we get Rome to join us? We can make our failed Messiah a once and for all sacrifice that is not just for us, it's going to be for all people for all time. But the Romans are not going to get set, they're not going to get circumcised. They're not going to want to keep the law. So we come up with something that allows them to get in without actually fitting in. Justification by faith. So I think that would explain why a Hebrew, if Paul is a Hebrew, would take the Jewish faith or take Judaism and open it up to Gentiles. Because we can't beat them.
Yeah.
We don't want to join them. We've got to make an inroad for them to join us. Syncretism.
Well, yeah, exactly. I actually don't believe Paul is the progenitor of this system. I think he's probably, so you can have people who, like some people might say Mike Tyson isn't the greatest heavyweight champ, but he might be one of the most popular. He may have been one of the guys who brought boxing to a certain kind of height that it hadn't been prior to. But there may have been people, I shouldn't say there may have been, there were people who were great boxers, maybe as great as he. He studied, anybody who, was it Customato, who was his teacher, had all these films. A lot of his moves, he got through the study of boxing that was taking place prior to him. And in a similar way, I think Paul, he's a Mike Tyson of sorts. I mean, if you go to the book of Acts, it was in like around chapter 6, 7, when Stephen gets seized by the Sanhedrin, you can see shades of Pauline theology in Stephen's speech, at least as it's put in Stephen's mouth. So whether or not that's true, I'm not enough of a scholar on the matter, but it seems that may have been part of the milieu. It may have been in the zeitgeist. It could have been a thing that was in the air, this idea, because there were passages, it was Stephen's, I think he said something like, he will restore David's fallen tent. And he makes references to the inclusion of non-Jewish people. And even if you look at the context of Acts chapter 6, there are Grecian widows who were being neglected due to the racism of the believers in Jerusalem. So here you already see there are at least Hellenistic Jews who are in the mix. So I always have all these analogies that are constantly coming to my mind. I think of hip hop, where recently there was a person who declared that, I think it was Dr. Umar, who said, Eminem can't be one of the top 10 or 5 rappers because he's a white guy. But what you see is, if a thing becomes popular enough, it's going to end up being more diverse, just by as a result, or necessarily as a result of its diversity. It's going to become more diverse. And then, however monocultural or mono-ethnic you thought it was or it should be, you're going to have to start figuring out ways to work, even in the most exclusive, like this religion was essentially an ethnic religion. Even in something that exclusive, you're going to have to come up with a scheme to make it more inclusive if it becomes popular enough. Why? Because you're going to start having Grecian Jews. You're going to start having, eventually, Gentiles who are interested. And then you're going to you're eventually going to run into the problem of, well, you have this kind of hairy thing, circumcision, and you have like an adult male, and he has to undergo this quite painful and humiliating rite of passage. It's one thing for babies to be submitted to that 7 days after their birth, but it's another thing for a grown man to have to. I don't think our audience can fully appreciate being 30, 40 years old, being converted by a message, and then being told, okay, now you got to meet up with the rabbi and pull your dick out and have him like cut the foreskin off of it. Like,
Right.
that's
I was gonna
nuts.
keep this joke
That's
inside, but
nuts.
since you went back and actually named the body part, you said a minute ago
Yeah.
you have this hairy thing. I'm like, wait, what are you talking about here?
Yeah, and sorry for the language. I'm not trying to be crass here. You know, I
Yeah.
wasn't. I'm just being blunt. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's two things, Chris. What do you think about that? Because I gave one, Jacob gave another. I'm saying the Paul here by design is trying to include Gentiles, and Jay Witt is saying, no, you got more Gentiles becoming interested in something that's Judaistic, and so sort of by default, someone is going back and trying to find ways to make it more appealing to Gentiles. So it's either by design or by default.
Yeah, I mean, I think your approach makes more sense to me. I kind of look at this kind of goes into like the grander question of like, I guess as an apologetic counter to the growth of Christianity. You know, Jay Witt makes a good point. Like I tend to think of the growth of Christianity in the same way I think of like evolution. So it's like if essentially Christianity is adaptable and Paul is a big part of that. And to Jay Witt's point, if basically Christianity would not spread if men still had to get circumcised to join it. That's part of the, that's part of the, I guess what allows it to do that, because it doesn't have that requirement. Anybody can join it. That's not a barrier because guys aren't gonna do it. But yeah, I think
Mhm.
I guess yeah, Paul, I guess by design, it being this minority religion and this kind of cultic offshoots, like, well, we're not gonna grow if we keep limiting people. So we gotta say everybody can come in terms of like, their ethnic background.
Yeah. And that's something that,
Yeah.
we'll never know. We'll never know which.
I mean, you can hardly think of a more prohibitory way of going about spreading your faith. Like then telling people they gotta undergo the scalpel circumcision. Like just imagine any group, if that's at the door, like where it's like you don't get in without that. Man, it's like, hey, count me out. Like, like if I'm at it's like, bro, it's like, see you later. I mean, I know eternal torment is at the other side of this, but this is kind of, this is a lot,
Yeah. Let's finish this chapter up. Verse 17. Oh no. 16. That is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his descendants, not only the adherents of the law, but also those who share in the faith of Abraham, for he is the father of us all, as it is written. I have made you the father of many nations. In the presence of the God in whom he believed, he gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. And for anybody who was in the word of faith, this is where they got the whole idea of speaking those things speaking those things that be not as though they were. Wait, is this where that comes from? Or this is the idea of speaking things into existence? Yeah. In hope, he believed against hope that he should become the father of many nations, as he had been told. Now, verse 18 should have been the cue for Paul to say, oh, wait, that's what was going on when him counting God as righteous, but he doesn't do that. So shall your descendants be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which is as good as dead, because he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No distrust, and this is funny, he says no distrust made him waver. He did waver. He was asking God for signs left and right. And that's funny to me because the father of faith was a man who doubted and needed God to confirm that he was really going to do what he said he was going to do. But Paul, in order to big up faith, Paul actually lies again to make it seem like Abraham never doubted. So Paul is really trying to sell, this is the snake oil here. Just have faith. And I love the point Jay Witt made. Why faith? Like, what's so, like, it could have been anything, but you make faith the thing. And this is why people are going to hell in the Christian schema for thought crimes. Because you could not get yourself to believe the right thing. Like Paul lowered the bar so low. Just believe. I mean, damn, all we want you to do is just believe and you'll get eternal life. I can't believe that. I don't. Come on, I'm lowering the bar as hard as much as I can. You don't have to do anything anymore. You don't have to just believe. And if I can't do that, well, then I'm doomed. It's a thought crime that I'm doomed for now. Like at least
You don't
it
have
made
I think
more
it's
sense.
asterisk.
Say again.
I said you don't have to do anything but have faith, asterisk.
Right. Go ahead, Jay Witt.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's worth noting just how technical he's getting with his parsing the Old Testament text, because he's talking about Abraham and he makes a parenthetical comment about his age, saying that his body was as good as dead and that he was 100. So for everybody who will claim that people like me, I was just simply a fundamentalist, reading it too literally when reading these stories, even your ends type characters who say, hey, you're taking passages too seriously. I'm at least taking them as seriously as Paul, who thinks that he has to stop to make commentary on the age of Abraham to drive home the point that of the apparent impossibility of God delivering on his promise because of his age and the deadness of his flesh. Like, if you look at this, it's pretty hard to imagine that Paul's making that argument, not thinking it's somewhat a truthful story, because it's hinged on the fact that Abraham is old, and there was every reason to believe that he wouldn't be able to produce the promise, and therefore it makes his faith even more remarkable that he believed against the odds. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think for everybody who wants, go ahead, Chris.
Saying not even just Paul, Jesus too.
Indeed.
Yeah. All right. Let's finish up the chapter here. He says, sorry, I'm trying to get my share back up. Y'all still see it, right?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. No distrust made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in the faith as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. This is why faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. So every time you hear and see this passage from now on, I would like you all to think, what is Paul doing? Where is he getting this from? And is that what's really happening in Genesis 15? Why did no rabbi, why did no scholar ever think that before Paul came along and said that? That's something that, needs to be thought about and considered there, because this is something that's being made up and out of thin air, but he's waving this around as the flag. That is why faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. But the words, it was reckoned to him, were written not for his sake alone, but for ours also. It will be reckoned to us who believe in him that raised from the dead Jesus our Lord, who was put to death for our trespass and raised for our justification. If God wants to save the world, God can save the world. God does not have to require faith. God is not forced to require anything to forgive sins or to save or to justify. The idea that it's going to take faith to do it is somebody saying, I want to believe in my religion, and I'm going to hold you at the gate of being able to get these benefits, and I'm going to use faith as the ticket in. A God who's omniscient and omnipotent does not have to do that. Why faith is the question. Well, because that's the only way I can hold you at the gate of my religion.
But also, it's a cheap.
I could have used circumcision to do it, but I'm going to use faith. I'm being nice. I'm going to use faith to do it. But what'd you say, Chris?
No, I'm saying it's a cheap ticket kind of to I think Jay Wick, either he didn't make this point directly. I feel like he said something that entailed it in terms of getting people in. Once you switch it from basically having to become a Jew, be it circumcision and being able to keep the law, and you just make a faith, well then like the price of admission is very low.
Yeah.
And then you get more members into your sect.
Well, that's a great point. The price of admission is very low, but it was a lot lower back in the days when everyone was superstitious and everyone had a myth and everyone had a. In today's world, that price is not so low. You're asking people to believe in a book that tells you the universe was made in 6 days, that there's a dome covering the earth that holds back waters above from waters below, that man was made separate from the rest of the animal kingdom, even though we can look at DNA now and say these humans and the great ape are related. You're asking us to believe in the earth that was flooded with no evidence for that. You're asking us to believe all these things, the Exodus from Egypt, and there's no evidence for that. And the conquest into Canaan, there's no evidence for that. An incarnation, a resurrection, there's no evidence for that. So now the thing that was once in the ancient world, where they believed in apotheosis, they believed that in dying and rising gods, they believed all these things. Yes, the faith being the price of admission into the religion probably seemed low then. Faith being the price of admission into the faith now is not so low a bar. And that's what Christians are having to contend with. You want people to believe these things that are unbelievable in a world that is becoming more and more show me.
But you have to appreciate the brilliance of Paul on some level, because by setting it up this way, you make it possible by saying Abram was 100 years old. First of all, he's pointing himself toward the cross, because he's saying his flesh was, he uses the term dead, right? His flesh was as good as dead, right? He was as good as dead at 100, pointing to where the point he's going to make salvation through the cross, through Christ's death, right? But also, the more unbelievable it is, right? Because Abraham believes God's promise to him that he's going to be the father of many, and he's already 100. He doesn't have a kid, right? So, and he still believes, and it's credit. So that now when the Christians confronted by all the things you just said, they have a precedent set in the text to believe over against the unbelievable. You see what I mean? Because for Abraham, right, it would have been unbelievable that he could father a kid at 100 years old. This is what Paul's highlighting. And so now when you say the DNA and everything, you can have your garden variety evangelical who says, yes, exactly. I'm following in the footsteps of Abraham, even though everything is saying, all the naturalistic observations point in the opposite direction. I'm going to believe God, right? And in doing so, I'm following in the footsteps of Abraham, a 100-year-old man who believed he was going to have a kid. So I think just like this is basically me hot linking back to the beginning of it, where we're saying Paul's usage of the way he reasons, he sets a precedent for the people who are going to follow him. The way he misuses the Old Testament, the way he just approaches, like the point he's making here is making it possible for somebody to look at evidence to the contrary and say, okay, yes, but I'm going to believe in the system because look what Abraham did. He believed over against all hope that God was going to give him a kid when he was 100 years old. So why can't I believe, even though we know the earth is older than 6,000 years old or whatever, I'm going to still believe it. Maybe God has obscured the age of the earth on purpose, just as a test of my faith. Right. You have Christians making these arguments.
Yeah.
Right?
You've
seen this probably on.
God gave Abraham something hard to believe. He's giving us something hard to believe.
Exactly. That's it. You said it. You said what it took me 3 minutes to say. Exactly.
I needed your 3 minutes just to come up with that little soundbite, though. But that's basically it. So now we end up glorying in. It's funny because Paul talks about people glorying in their shame. That's sort of what Christianity ends up asking you to do: is glorying in something that you probably should be ashamed of. These ideas that
throw me something.
Go ahead.
Throw me something impossible to believe, and I'll believe it. Basically, right. It's like you become a believing machine. It's like, hey, I am a bona fide belief machine. You could tell me whatever, I'm gonna believe it. Right? Yeah. That's what you turn yourself into. A credulous individual.
Yeah. but I think it goes to the point Chris made earlier when we were talking about ends, but only these unbelievable claims, not the unbelievable claims in another book. Only these unbelievable claims. Like that's the thing.
No, you need to say that louder. I feel like you need to, Chris, you want to elaborate on that just a little more?
I'm not sure that I'm tracking, although I do think, to your point, Brady, about, so I could just hear someone saying, you're saying we're asking people to believe that the earth is 6,000 years old, that dinosaurs and people lived together. And so the cost of faith is more expensive now. But I'm sure there's an apologist that's saying that, like, well, you don't have to believe those things. In fact, I have arguments that would show that, basically I can make the Bible agree with science. The problem with that is that it's expensive for the person who's not already a believer, like cognitively, to make those decisions. Like, okay, so should I believe that? Should I believe what it seems like the Bible kind of plainly says about a lot of things that go against that more sophisticated reinterpretation? And faith again shows up as this coupon cognitively to cut the price of all of that. Because we'll just say, well, we believe the essentials, which cuts all of that, and we have faith in those things. And so, like, faith reappears as this kind of a cognitive expense cutting tool.
No, you said it best when you said coupon. That was a great illustration. Coupon is better than tool. Yes, that's great.
A cognitive expense cutting coupon. Wow.
Yes, that's great. That I couldn't have been worded any better. Yes. And I like the fact that because I was dealing primarily, so your pushback is warranted, because I was dealing primarily with like more of your fundamentalist evangelical, but it seems that you're dealing with the more intellectual side of evangelicalism, which tries to embrace the advances that the things we've uncovered by virtue of the advances in science and so forth. But even they are employing cognitive, what did you say? Cognitive
expense cutting.
Well, I mean, like, it's expensive for a person to think about these things. So faith is that tool that cuts that cost.
Well, it's faith, and on the other side of that coupon is mystery.
Oh yeah.
It's mystery, because mystery also cuts.
That's having the employee discount. Like, if faith doesn't get it there, he'll just. I own it, so I just swipe my card.
Mystery is the employee discount.
Mystery is the ultimate write-off.
Yeah, because without those two, this is an expensive belief system. You have to, your intellectual capabilities, you're bankrupt by the time you end up believing these things.
Wow.
Yep. Fellas, I don't know if there's much more to say. That's Romans chapter 4. Anybody who's been tuning in, you can go back. We've done Romans 1, 2, 3, and now 4. Albert Kim will be back with us next week for Romans chapter 5. And Chris, would you be willing to come back on a future episode to come back and chop some of this up?
Absolutely. Yeah. Always.
Appreciate you.
Have we solicited super chats and told people?
We have not.
We always try to make it a point to tell you guys. I know you participate in the chats, but please be sure to let us know where you're listening from in the comment section of this video, if possible, or even just saying I'm listening in Arkansas or something. That's just great. That'll do. We just need to populate our comment section with comments so that the algorithm is satiated. Also,
and just to be clear, he's not saying put that in the chat. He's saying make a comment on the actual video, and please make sure that you like, subscribe, hit the notification so you know that when we pop on live. Jay Witt and I will be back on Tuesday for Exit Strategy at 8:00 p.m. Eastern. And yes, we will appreciate any super chats that you guys give. Helps with all the expenses. I put the link to the store in the chat. You can go get you some merch. As you can see, I'm rocking the Who is Jay Witt hoodie right now. We have Ichabod hoodies. We got t-shirts coming up for the summer. I Escape the Cult t-shirts. So yeah, go get you some merch. Drop a super chat if you can. You can drop super chats even if it's not live. You can still super chat us. And I'm sorry, I forgot. Biggest news of all. Ichabod, I should have said this at the beginning. You can now find the podcast on Spotify, on Amazon, and on Apple. So you can get your listen in while you're working. Somebody said, yo, I deliver mail. It's hard to keep going back to YouTube to start it back up. The podcast is now on streaming services, and it'll be on more eventually. But right now it's on Spotify, Amazon, and Apple. So definitely subscribe there. Drop your comments. We love you guys. Thank you for tuning in. And yeah, we'll catch you guys on Tuesday. Peace.
Yeah, this was dope.